IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. As you know, every Friday we tend to talk about things that aren't strictly policy related but are tangential to it. Today I have with me Roshni Kannan, who is a researcher with CEPT Ahmedabad. Roshni works extensively on issues related to space and gender, especially as applied to Indian cities. So what we're going to be talking about over the course of the next half hour or so is broadly the way that Indian urban spaces are experienced differently for peoples of different genders and different sexual orientations. So let's break it down. Let's go back to the very beginning, right? Roshni, so can you help me understand, first of all, what the concept of a gendered space really means? I'm sure that myself and a lot of our listeners would already we have grown up in a fairly standard Indian household where there's kind of a division of labor between the mother and father in the raising of children and so on. Is it somewhat related to that? Can you provide us with a little bit of context?
The concept of gendered space itself arises from the two words that makes it up, gender and space. So the whole concept of space is part of a larger idea where you look at space and you look at its not opposite per se, but you look at its contemporary. It's called place. So when you look at space and place together, space can sort of be defined as the as a dynamism of place. Place is a very static notion, something that is bound in geography, something that is bound in a particular societal construct or the lack thereof. But space encompasses a geography in all of the societal constructs that make it up. So space particularly is the manifestation of, you could say, the negotiation between tendencies of society, whether they are economic, cultural, humanistic, behavioral, experiential. These parameters are what make up space. But place is more of, it's purely physical, like the points on a map that a cartographer would plot. So when you say gendered spaces, you don't call it a gendered place because gender is a part of the social parameter that makes up a space itself. So you cannot call a place a gendered place, but you can call a space a gendered space because of its dynamic characteristic.
Okay, so if I understand this correctly, what you're saying is that space refers to something physical, something that doesn't have any inherent value to it. So for example, just a road by itself has no actual value to it. But if it's a road that is outside a temple, for example, that is host to a certain kind of social activity, then it becomes an actual space with a kind of meaning that's attached to it.
Yeah, so the whole point of the place and space theory is that although they are different, they are two sides of the same coin. You cannot separate them to look at them as two different entities. You cannot look at place without a space, without its spatial characteristic, and you cannot look at space without the physicality of, what binds it over there. So place and space come from two different approaches to social studies, where why we call it gendered space is because place comes from this theoretical notion of being static, where something as static as geography, where you can pinpoint a place on a map and say that, this is the capital of the country. But the capital of the country has so much more layers enmeshed into it.
there's this whole history, there's all these social meanings that are attached to it, the political meanings that are attached to it. Okay, so fair enough. I think I get your overall point. But how does that apply to a space such as the Indian household? What does it mean to talk about the gendering of a space in the context of a home?
So the gendered aspect of any space, so in architecture, what we call as gender geographies, or in anthropology, what we call as gender geographies, are spaces that come with a certain gendered connotation. Now, gender cannot be equated to sex biologically, but gender is more of a social construct. Gender is more about the kind of behavioral aspects, the kind of experiential aspects that a person acquires through society. But sex is something that you are born with. It is something innate, something that you cannot control. Whereas gender is something that it's an attribute. It's like the way you talk or the way you dress, gender makes up all of those things. So when you call it gender geographies, or say in the example of a home, when any household or any house can be divided into primary spaces like the living room, the dining room, the kitchen, the bedrooms, the balconies, the bathrooms, the terraces, and spatially these can be seen as public, semi-public, and private spaces. So what constitutes the public spaces are probably the ones, very simply put, the ones you entertain guests in, say the balconies or the living rooms or the dining rooms. What semi-public spaces are they have this sort of restricted permeability to them, where yes, guests can access it, but they would not particularly access it. Maybe say the kitchen or the utility. Private spaces are the bedrooms, places where you don't, it's a more of a family oriented space. But when you look at gender geographies inside the house, and this will also extend into a meta idea of how we move within a larger space like the urban, how we look at the gender geographies of the home is that when I say kitchen, the listener's mind automatically goes to a woman cooking in it. Mm-hmm. When I say living room, the listener's mind automatically goes to a father reading a paper over there on a Monday morning with the TV blaring loudly. When I say balcony, the listener automatically sees a party being hosted or a late evening sort of a thing. But the house as an entity, as an architectural space, is not constructed with underlying gendered connotations. An architect does not go and plan a space saying that, oh, so the kitchen has to be a very feminine space. But there is a subconscious, uncontrollable urge to associate certain genders and certain gendered roles with certain spaces. And this aspect of how we view spaces and how we view gender and gendered roles are what makes spaces gendered. They are not in their conception gendered, but they are in their perception very much so.
So there's a lot of breakdown here. So let me just kind of summarize it to see if I've understood this properly. When a house is designed, the space in itself is not designed with the idea that it has to be feminine or that it has to be masculine, but because of the way that, for example, an Indian family is structured, because of the way that various roles in the Indian family are distributed according to our own stereotypes of what these genders should be doing, especially the idea that our mothers should be cooking, for example. These spaces which are technically gender neutral tend to be inhabited by people who conform to a particular socially engendered role, which is how they tend to gain this idea of being gendered spaces.
Yes, pretty much. And what you see as a micro narrative inside the home can be also extended into the urban or into the city level in the same way. With it's like applying the theory of similarity. The scale is different, but the aspect of how you treat spaces are the same. So, for example, curfews are a very simple and efficient and relatable way to understand how the city works in extremely gendered manner. Say, for example, when you look at the urban or when you look at the city as an extension of the domestic or the house, you can apply the same principles of accessibility to the urban as well in terms of public and private. So the public would be your public infrastructure like your parks and your beaches and your other public spaces, so to say, squares and all. And your private spaces would be your demarcated neighborhoods like your commercial neighborhoods, your residential neighborhoods and whatnot. Now, if you look at this concept of public and private through the lens of gender, and I'm very sure that everybody would have their own experience, walking in the city. The concept of curfew, even in your own hometown, arises from the fact that the subjugation of a certain gender by another gender, subjugation of the female gender by the male gender, or the prominent gender, gives rise to this sort of a concept of how safe or how accessible the other or the marginalized gender looks at and accesses the city. Say, for example, what we can see when women are walking through what do you call quote unquote shady area would be a public space, but not so much accessed by women as much as men, or not so much accessed by a transgender community as much as men. So the hegemony of the male in the Indian society gives rise to almost every aspect of how we view and access the city.
So the default occupant in a public space in a city, a road, a park, and so on, would be people of the male gender and their male friends. Because I'm sure that all of us younger Indians especially have noted that if we're out in public with our lady friends, or if women friends of ours are around with no men around, then they automatically seem to become less privileged citizens in the public space. It's somehow more acceptable for them to receive certain kinds of unwanted attention.
Yes.
When, for example, I come home, come back to Bangalore really late at night, back in the good old days when we could still travel, this is one moment that I've never really forgotten. I got back to Bangalore at around 2 a.m. or so in the morning. And there's a bunch of auto guys waiting at the bus stand, and all of them seem a little shady, and they all are asking for some pretty ridiculous rates. So I decided to just throw caution to the winds and just walk 2 kilometers back to my place. I don't think that any woman that I know would have done anything of that sort, because by virtue of being a woman in a space that is dominated by men at a certain time of day, when there aren't any other women around, she is basically at the mercy of these men, and these men are free to kind of exhibit all the virtues, or the quote-unquote virtues of their gender, be as loud, as abrasive, as abusive as they would like to be, and we're supposed to let it go because quote-unquote boys will be boys, or that's basically what men will do, that's basically what the male gender is expected to do, so let it be. There is no broader expectation that all public spaces in a city have to be safe for all genders, because by default, the expectation is that beyond a certain time of day, these are male spaces. And women can enter them, but only with men if they want to be safe. And since most Indian families want to be abundantly safe, they would rather keep their daughters at home than give them permission to step out. And if, God forbid, something should happen to them, then society will very piously shake its heads and say that it was, after all, a woman's fault, because how can you expect men to be any different?
Yes. So there's one thing that I would like to add, that cities, the urban, just like the home, in fact, more so than the home, are designed to be gender neutral, because in a house, you always have this ideal family setup where there is a father, there is a mother, and there are 2 children, almost always one girl and one boy. But in a city, the sex ratio really gets thrown off by the amount of migrants that you have, by the amount of floating population that it has, and the if it is a place like say Bangalore or Chennai or Gurgaon, you would almost always see a very, very large chunk of the population that is floating, rather than if you see a more established city, and by established I mean cities that do not have the culture of migration, like Ahmedabad, so to say, or Kolkata for that matter. You wouldn't see the sex ratio being in a very, very skewed manner. The problem with cities being inherently gendered outside their conception is a problematic thing when it comes to smaller things like gays, moral policing or the concept of gays. So, what I mean by gays is that there is this philosopher called Foucault, Michel Foucault. He is a French philosopher, and he's known for one of his most prominent works on the concept of gaze and the panopticon. So, in his book called Discipline and Punish, what he describes is this ideal concept of the prison system as was redefined in the 1980s by the West. He says that there is this concept of a tower in the prison, which was redefined in the middle, where you had an abstract entity or an entity whose identity was not known, who was always having his gaze on the prisoners whose towers were arranged around the central tower. So there was always this concept of being seen but not seeing. So this imbalance of seeing and being seen, where one person is only being seen and the other person is only seeing, can be applied to the concept of gaze or gendered gaze in Indian cities more so than any other city.
I think it's probably worth clarifying at this point that when Roshni says gaze, she means G-A-Z-E, not G-A-Y-S.
Yeah, I mean G-A-Z-E. So this is particularly relevant when you look at cities not just through the first and the second gender, but also through the third gender. So because Indian cities are designed, they have developed through history. They are not a stratified monolithic layer of post-industrial revolution development like we see in the West. But we have cities.
Yeah, but a lot of major Indian cities today have occupied history of centuries, if not thousands of years.
Yeah, like Kolkata, for example, or Chennai, or Delhi, or Bangalore, or any of these cities that date back to Mughal emperors or, invasions and whatnot. You see all of these cities, they have developed in a very organic manner, which is the indigenous way of development for Indian cities, where there is no particular space where you see that beyond this point a woman cannot go, or beyond this point this particular person cannot go. And the concept of gaze is particularly relevant when you look at how Indian cities have developed after the British colonial invasion, because that is when you can see, visibly see, or if I have to be politically correct, that is when you see in recorded history the position of the cisgendered binary getting sort of elevated and the other gendered and sexual orientations sort of being marginalized, so to say.
So in plain English or in plain invaders language, it's the relationship between the male in the male body and the female in the female body becoming the be-all, end-all of the kind of gaze of the state. The state is most interested in ensuring that men conform to the activities expected of the male gender and that women conform to the activities expected of the female gender. And when I say men and women, I'm referring to people who are biologically men and women, so people of the male sex and people of the female sex. But of course, as you alluded to, that obviously leaves out people who are born with the genitalia of one sex but identify with another sex, or people who are born with the genitalia of both sexes, or people who are born with genitalia of one sex lose that genitalia through a process and become another gender, or people whose gender identity itself does not conform to this binary, does not conform to this
Yes.
idea that men must be a certain way, or that women must be a certain way, these non-binary kind of individuals. So yeah, where exactly do they fall? Because I would think that even in the modern Indian city, given that there's already an unequal relationship, especially in public spaces, between the cisgendered man, so a man in a man's body, and the cisgendered woman, so the woman in the woman's body. Leave aside the man in the man's body who's attracted to men, or the woman in the woman's body who's attracted to women. People whose bodies don't conform to the sex that they identify with, or transgender people, don't really fit into our conception at all. And I assume that gaze kind of works into the way that we see them there.
Yeah, you're right. So it is interesting at this point to sort of, when we are talking about the third gender or the transgender community of India, it is common knowledge that this community has been existing from a very, very, very far point in history, far behind us. Recorded history speaks about them in whatever capacity, but they become more prominent towards the time of the Mughal invasion. And so when the Mughal invasion happened, the transgender people, the indigenous transgender community of India, whoever these invaders encountered, all of these transgender people who fell in the path of these invaders became almost always subjected to slave trade. They were almost always taken into either the harem of the kings, or some of them to fight in the military or to take care of the artillery or whatnot. And
Roshni, this was happening well before the period of the Mughals as well. I mean, the Delhi Sultanate, for example, was founded on the backs of this military slavery, ghulams as they were called, and this was not something that they were doing particularly in India. Like, a lot of these ghulams were actually imported from Central Asia. A lot of them were men who had been castrated as boys and then were trained to become like these slave soldiers.
Yes.
So the Delhi Sultanate was founded on the backs of these men. A lot of the highest nobles of the Delhi Sultanate, ironically, were eunuchs, were men who had been castrated. So I don't think it's necessarily accurate to say that transgender people were necessarily rounded up and brought into the harems of these kings, because first of all, we do know that eunuchs were being used to guard the harems of kings way before that period. If I'm not wrong, I think Kautilya also mentions that the king's harem should be guarded by eunuchs, should be guarded by old men, old women who can't impinge upon the king's reproductive rights. Sleeping with his queens.
Those who don't pose a certain threat on the queen or the concubines or whatever. Exactly.
So, and again, I'm not sure that transgender people were always necessarily a fixture of the court, because I've come across references where transgender people kind of live by themselves. They have their own kind of establishments. In fact, in one of the most famous of all Sanskrit plays, the Mrichakatikam, the little toy clay cart, there is a character who is very evidently going out with a man who has been castrated, or who might just be gay. We can't be entirely sure. So there clearly is some kind of understanding, even before the British arrive, that there is a third gender. I wouldn't necessarily think the Mughals were different in what they were doing to transgender people so much as, since they're arguably one of the more powerful North Indian empires, they're just building on an existing substrate which already sees transgender people as somewhat different, somewhat other, and therefore in possession of sometimes auspicious powers, in possession of course, not having sexual and reproductive powers. They are suitable for being brought into the harem to protect the queens, that kind of stuff. But it is interesting that, especially in India, compared to a lot of its contemporaries, right? So in the Ottoman Empire, for example, eunuchs were an enormous part of the Ottoman bureaucracy and of the Ottoman military. This was drawing in part on older like Byzantine Christian traditions where noble families would castrate one of the younger sons so they could be basically the uncle who helps all his other nephews kind of advance into the imperial bureaucracy. But in India, it does not necessarily seem to me that eunuchs were as big a thing in government as they were in China, for example, or in the Ottoman Empire, as I said. They seem to have been, as I said, this other who are present sometimes in courts, but mostly attached to the harem. In the Sultanate period, as I said, you see eunuchs sometimes occupying military roles or sometimes occupying political roles. But by the Mughal period, that's very much kind of faded. The Mughals are a much more traditional, quote-unquote, traditional Indian kingdom in that sense, where you have a very clear kind of male-female divide, and the men do virile things and the men do feminine things. So I think I'm going to have to disagree with you there, but I think you are trying to make a larger point in terms of how the treatment of these people kind of differed over time, right?
Yeah, exactly. So you see their presence constantly being there, but when you can very predominantly see it sort of take a nosedive is around the it's around the 1850s, I would say, the 1850s or the early 1860s, where the British incursion had already become very strong. They were already having the upper hand over all of the administrative and other operations of the country. And at that point of time, at around 1871, the British introduced this act called the Criminal Tribes Act into the legislation of the country. This act had two parts, how it sort of materialized and why it materialized. How to answer the first question, it would be I would have to circle back to how the gender binary of the cis hetero binary of male and female sort of strengthens at that point of time, because the colonies were subjected to a more a more narrow outlook on gender than the colonizers were in their own land, because the colonies could not know any better. And when the colonizers came into this new land and they found these new people that they had not seen in their country before, they sort of became uncomfortable and started characterizing these people as criminals, because they were criminal. The only crime they did was that they were not conforming to a larger binary. So this is the reason the Criminal Tribes Act came into place. Transgenders were one of the many people, one of the many communities that were affected in this act because of their bodily identification. And this act, starting from 1871 up until 1924, underwent 4 iterations, and finally in 1924 it became the Habitual Offenders Act, wherein the transgender people were removed from the bracket of criminal tribes and they sort of went into the very infamous Section 377 as we used to know it 2 years ago.
Okay, so once again, there's a lot to unpack here. First of all is that, how presumptuous do you have to be to come into a country that's thousands of years old and say, hey, you know what, the way that you guys have been doing gender relations and managing sexuality is all wrong, and our God tells us that it's wrong, so we're going to create all these legally enforceable things and strip you people of your property if you don't conform to our regressive idea of what gender should be like. That in itself is so ridiculous. And then the very names of all these acts are just so utterly patronizing. The Habitual Offenders Act, like being gay is an addiction or something. What is that supposed to even mean? Oh, how obnoxious.
And it is actually quite interesting to know the categories, quote unquote, that made up the Criminal Tribes Act. So they had 4 categories. The first one was the incorrigible, the habitual, the second one was the habitual, the third one was the accidental criminals, and the fourth one was the criminal tribes or castes. So if you look at each of these, very, very broadly, if you're going to look at each of these four categories, more or less you can see them all circling back to how we know the caste system today, how we know the tribal system today, how we know the gender system today, how in cities, if we see a shoddily dressed man, we automatically assume that he is a pickpocket or he is an offender, say the habitual pickpocket or the accidental criminal who by the accident of birth is viewed as a criminal even though he is not. So these very preposterous categories that made up this very preposterous act is quite interesting to know, as to it gives a very good insight as to how these people categorize their criminals as well, because within these four categories, like you have a hierarchy in the caste system, you have a hierarchy inside these four categories of the Criminal Tribes Acts as well, where the
That's a very interesting point. I hadn't seen it that way, but yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
So where one, say for example, the incorrigible would get a larger sentence for the same crime than an accidental criminal, or the criminal tribe or the criminal caste would get a larger penalization than a habitual criminal for the same crime, which is pretty much how
literally the Arthashastra was like quite literally says that, hey, you know what, if you're a Brahmin and you kidnap a woman, then you pay this amount of fine, and if you're a Kshatriya and you kidnap a woman, you pay twice this, and if you're a Vaishya who does it, you pay thrice this, and if you're a Shudra does it, that's it, you're dead. That's all.
Exactly, no questions asked. So this is how it sort of progressed, and when you see today how we look at, let's take a quick 200-year jump into how we know society as today. When you look at over the last 150 years or 170 years or so, you would see that over the last 15 years, we have remarkably progressed in terms of how we as a society cater towards the inclusion of all genders in our cities. So contrary to the notion that women cannot step out of the house after 8 o'clock, you now see at 12 o'clock, you see in these cosmopolitan cities, women and men are out in equal capacity, not in equal safety, but in equal capacity.
Yeah.
And it would be unfair to just speak about the male and the female, but when you look at the transgender community also, you can see that their acceptance and inclusion in the urban has sort of grown over the years, and you have a lot of proof for it in terms of, say, legal acts, court cases, activism, whatnot, and it's very interesting to note that they are accepted in the city because they have to be. I don't know if I'm making sense over here, but the city caters to them more than it used to cater to them 15 years ago. Because of how we as a society have become more accepting, and because of multiple reasons. But fact of the matter still remains that they might not be legal criminals, but they still remain moral criminals. So I, as a woman, would be able to, say, find a house to rent, something as simple as your basic trinity, food, clothes and housing. Me, as a cisgendered heterosexual woman, would be able to find a house to stay or a house to rent very, very easily, as compared to a transgender person who it's a very interesting there's a very interesting documentary called Is it too much to ask, which is just a 45-minute documentary of two trans women in the city of Chennai trying to find a house to rent. And it's very appalling to see the kind of reasons that they are given to not, and they would have probably in the documentary gone to at least 10-15 houses, and they don't get a single house. And the very ridiculous reasons range from we don't allow meat eaters in this house to we don't know what you are, therefore we cannot give you a house. So while they may be legally a citizen like you and me, they are morally still very, very, very behind the timeline of acceptance and inclusion in society. So while cities accept them, society does not. And I think that is a very important difference to understand, where the architectural urban and the social urban come into play.
That's a very interesting point. I think it ties very neatly to our initial conversation about the concept of a gendered space, right? Because perhaps homeowners think of the homes that they own in very starkly gendered terms, that this is a home that is meant for a family, and a family is a man and a woman and their son and their daughter. It's practically impossible for them to conceive of a home as something that might be inhabited by someone who does not fall within that very rigidly ordered vision of what gender and sexual relations should look like. And even if the city more broadly allows transgender people to navigate these spaces and navigate them with far more freedom and far more financial security than they might have been able to do in the British period, the fact that our society's notion of what a gendered space is still remains stuck very much within that British binary.
Yes.
Means that our cities and our homes still remain profoundly unsafe and hostile places to the third gender.
Yeah, quite so. I mean, very apparently so, I would say, because while theoretically we all like to be very politically correct, accepting people, I don't think that most of even the liberated youth of the country, so to say, would be comfortable sitting in the same public space as a transgender does, because over the course of the last 200 years we have been conditioned at multiple levels. There have been multiple checkpoints in society where we have been told, chided, warned about how these transgender people are the unsavory elements of society, or how they are the, we have so many names for them, we have so many insults, slurs for them that we equate to their existence. And I think it would be very interesting to note that in a lot of movies, even the movies that have been directed over the last, I would say, 8, 9, 10 years, you would expect that an morally emancipated society like India over the last 10 years would choose to represent transgenders in a more empowered way. It is very sad to note that we still don't. We still say in movies like Appu, or in movies like Nagar Kirtan, which is a very beautiful Bengali movie. In these movies, they are seen as very unsavory elements of society, where people police them very, very openly and brashly as to this, why are you here? This place does not belong to people like you. So how do you define people like you? Coming back to my original point, while they remain free of the Section 377, they still remain a prisoner of the larger society, I would say. And I don't know if it would, not to get too preachy, but I don't know if it would change, if there is a possibility of it developing and changing despite all of this activism. I think it would be a very slow process to look at cities gendered for, or rather accommodating outside the binary as well.
I agree. I'm a little doubtful about the idea that India is really a morally emancipated society, as you said.
Yeah.
I think you make a very good.
We would like to think of ourselves as one.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yes.
We all like to say I'm so woke and everything, but it remains what it is. We call a spade a spade. It remains what it is.
Yeah, And especially the point you made about how movies represent transgender people, I think is very telling. You had this really interesting thesis where you argued, I think the term that you use is that there's an osmotic relationship between cinema and life. And you said that art imitates life, and similarly, life imitates art. The kind of biases, the kind of expectations that we set for ourselves and for society in movies are to a great extent the kind of expectations that I think are also revealed within our own lives. And in that context, I'm constantly bugged by Bollywood's latest rash of quote-unquote historical movies where Muslims are always evil and Hindus are always good. And of course, as you pointed out, where transgender people are always immoral and heterosexual couples are always moral. Thank you so much, Roshni. I think that's a lot of food for thought. Thank you so much for joining us on All Things Policy. And thank you all of our listeners for joining us on this Friday. We hope that you learned something interesting and see Indian cities with a new lens from tomorrow onwards. Thank you guys so much. Thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. I'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Paytm Money. Some really fun guests on the network this week. Cyrus welcomed Dia Mirza to come and have a conversation about all kinds of different things. Danny Morrison was on Edges and Sledges, the cricket podcast. If you haven't heard that, that's always a fun listen. And Rahul Subramanian was on Football Shitball to grow their ever more exciting list of guests. And it's not just that. Mantra Mugh, the old friend of ours, was on Advertising is Dead. Manu Pillai was on the Filter Coffee podcast. It's been one great guest after the other. And with that, we hope to catch you again next week.
Entertainment is like food for the brain. It's a window to culture and a great way to understand the world around us. The internet has changed what it means to be an entertainer, creating new storytellers with millions of fans. It has spawned a new breed, the story sellers, those behind the scenes creating the business for this ecosystem. They work with brands, platforms, and channels who are keen to capitalize on an audience hungrier than ever for more stories. I'm Vineet Kanabar, and I have a ringside view to how stories are told and sold. On my show, I bring you creators, artists, executives, and marketers for a freewheeling conversation around the business of entertainment. Tune in to Storytellers and Story Sellers for personal stories, analysis, and criticism every Thursdays as I talk to the brightest minds telling or selling great stories today.